Boa noite a todas e todos. Bem-vindas, bem-vindos. Muito obrigada pela presença. Meu nome é Fernanda, eu sou sócia da Megafauna, editora também, fui editora de ciência também da 451. Eu queria muito agradecer à Companhia das Letras, e em especial ao Otávio Marques, por toda a comunicação e pela parceria nesse encontro. Queria agradecer à equipe da Megafauna e ao Arthur Mello, que também é sócio, meu amigo querido, que teve essa ideia genial e está aqui hoje dividindo comigo essa live. É uma alegria enorme, uma honra conversar com o professor Robert Sapolsky, que fala pela primeira vez para o público brasileiro. Esse encontro acontece também por ocasião do lançamento no Brasil desse catatal Comporte-se, a biologia humana em nosso pior e melhor. Eu queria avisar que essa apresentação, essa conversa está sendo transmitida, tem duas transmissões, né? Uma com o áudio original e uma que é toda em português. E vocês podem encontrar o link na própria página do YouTube, onde ela está acontecendo, tem o link se alguém quiser mudar de canal. Eu queria passar, então, a palavra para o Arthur e para a gente começar.
Obrigado, Fernanda. Obrigado de novo à Companhia das Letras por todo o apoio. Bom, o que eu posso dizer é uau, que felicidade estar hoje aqui falando com Robert Sapolsky. O Robert, ele é neuroendocrinologista, primatologista e escritor. O Robert, ele dá aulas de biologia, neurobiologia, na Universidade de Stanford. O Robert já recebeu inúmeros prêmios e condecorações, entre eles o Genius Grant, da MacArthur Foundation, por, abre aspas, a sua extraordinária originalidade e dedicação em suas buscas criativas. O Robert já escreveu 7 livros, entre eles Porque as Zebras Não Têm Úlceras e Memórias de um Primata, e, claro, Comporte-se, que hoje a gente está celebrando o lançamento aqui para os leitores brasileiros. Robert, muito obrigado por ter aceitado o nosso convite. Eu devo admitir que eu sou um enorme fã e um admirador do seu trabalho, ainda que tardiamente. Eu vi pela primeira vez o seu TED há 2 anos e eu fiquei encantado com a sua obra. Então, é um prazer enorme estar aqui hoje com minha amiga querida e sócia Fernanda para a gente conversar. Eu queria começar com uma das suas definições da nossa espécie. Nós, seres humanos, somos capazes de comportamentos terríveis, como usar chuveiros para liberar gases venenosos, aviões como armas e estupros em massa como estratégia militar. Somos também uma espécie com a capacidade de atos magníficos e arrebatadores. E eu faço um adendo. Somos a espécie que é capaz de criações como o teatro do Shakespeare, a teoria da relatividade e as óperas do Strauss. Então, isso me leva para a questão inevitável. Depois de tantos anos estudando, eu queria que você me falasse o que você entende pelo comportamento humano e por que nós somos capazes, como espécie, de tantas atrocidades mas, ao mesmo tempo, de tantos atos tão magníficos. Muito obrigado.
Well, I guess the simplest way to answer that is to say we're complicated. We're a complicated species. We're a complicated species mainly, if I had to summarize it all, because we are constructed on the same basic blueprint, the same basic biological pattern as any other primate out there, same brain regions, same neurons, same types of neurotransmitters, same basic function. And in that regard, we're no different from any other species. And then we go and use those same exact bits of wiring in ways that are completely unprecedented in any other species at all. And that's sort of the challenge of us, seeing the ways in which we are just like and the ways in which we bear no resemblance to any other species. I mean, the example that comes to mind is that we have the exact same neurobiology and endocrinology when we are being murderous to another human, as would a chimp to another chimp, or baboon to a baboon, so on. But unlike them, we can kill somebody whose face we never see. We can kill somebody on the other side of the planet with a drone missile. We can kill someone whose existence we don't even know of, rather than this being the face of someone in front of you. And at the same time, we are not the only species capable of empathy and care and compassionate acts and all of that. But we don't just do it for relatives or individuals we're familiar with, whose face we see every single day. We can press a send button on a computer and send money to the other side of the planet compassionately to someone whose face we will never see. And we're just a bizarre species in that regard, because we're using the same old biology, but in ways that are just unheard of, that no chimp could make any sense of.
Antes de fazer uma pergunta propriamente, eu queria matar uma curiosidade, porque eu dei muita risada lendo seu livro. Algumas vezes eu, inclusive, ri de nervoso, né? Mas o humor é um traço super marcante do seu texto. Parece que você se diverte muito trabalhando, né? Nesse sentido, eu pergunto se existe alguma intenção na escolha do título do livro, Behave, que é um verbo e não um substantivo. Em português, ele soa como uma espécie de conselho de mãe para filho. Comporte-se, menino. O que, ao final da leitura do livro, parece ser uma coisa impossível de obedecer. Pergunto se o caminho para o bom comportamento também passa pelo humor.
No, not at all. And I'm glad in Portuguese the book's title has that sense also, because the choice of the word behave was definitely for its ambiguity in English. But in terms of the need for humor, absolutely not. My guess is that Mother Teresa was not a whole lot of fun to sit around and tell jokes with, yet she managed to do some good things. At the same time, the core of so much of humor is hostility and ridicule and things of that sort. So they don't necessarily go hand in hand, but I personally always appreciate a book or a lecture that wakes me up now and then by somebody having a sense of humor.
Bom, eu queria agora mudar, então, entrar no livro e queria falar sobre estresse. O senso comum normalmente entende o estresse negativamente, né? Mas a gente, lendo o livro, entende que não é bem assim, né? Que existe um bom estresse, um estresse positivo, que traz benefícios à sobrevivência, ao desenvolvimento e à socialização, e um estresse prejudicial. E eu queria entender assim, um pouco essa diferença e como é possível saber quando a gente está lidando com um ou outro tipo. E, por exemplo, os atletas de alta performance não estariam submetidos a um estresse radical o suficiente para ser ruim, né?
Yes. Well, let's see, right off the bat, to make any sense of human stress, what needs to be considered is for 99% of organisms on this planet, stress is about somebody is really trying to eat you in the next 30 seconds, or you were very intent on trying to eat somebody else in the next 30 seconds, a short-term physical crisis. And the stress response, what you do with your body during stress, is brilliant at letting you survive something like that. It mobilizes energy to your muscles, it increases your blood pressure, it makes you think more clearly, it turns off silly parts of your biology that you don't need to be expending energy on. You know, a lion is chasing you, ovulate some other time, don't worry about it right now, that sort of thing. So it is brilliantly adaptive for being stressed like a normal organism. And then what do we do as humans, or some of the socially most intelligent primates, probably cetaceans, whales, dolphins, elephants as well? What we do is have the capacity to be psychologically stressed for long, long periods of time. And the punchline of the entire field is, like, if you secrete these hormones for 30 seconds, they save your life. And if you secrete these hormones every single day because of psychological distress, you're going to get sick, because everything you're doing is fine to survive the next 3 minutes and is a disaster if this is what your entire life is like. And every stress-related disease there is out there is a consequence of, this would be a great thing to do with your body if you were running away from a lion. And this is a terrible thing to do with your body if you're thinking about global warming or mortality or politics or any such thing. So in that context, what we have is, we're a very weird species. We secrete, you know, think about, you know, a presidential election next year, for example, and you will secrete the exact same stress hormone as does a bird and a fish and a reptile and an amphibian. Almost certainly 100 million years ago, there was some dinosaur who was being like pushed off his territory by some other dinosaur, secreting the exact same molecules that we secrete when we think about psychological stuff. And then we go and we use it for completely strange things. We can be stressed not just by these chronic psychosocial things, we can be stressed by what is happening to a character in a book we're reading. We can be stressed by somebody on a movie screen who's nothing more than pixels and a computer generated image. We can be stressed reading about how awful it must have been when Pompeii exploded 2,000 years ago. We just do stuff with our stress response that no other organism comes close to. So in that regard, to actually finally answer your question, so you sit and you think about this long enough, and that's all I think about, my lab and my field work, stress and stuff. And like, the easy conclusion is, what is one's job as a scientist, as a parent, as an educator, as a psychotherapist, whatever, to cure us of stress, to make stress disappear? And of course, not only is that impossible, but that would be a disaster, because we don't hate stress. We just hate the wrong kind of stress. And when it's the right kind, we love it. We pay money to be stressed in the right way, to be in a scary movie, to go on a roller coaster ride, all of that. When it's the right kind of stress, it's spectacular. And when it's the right kind of stress, it's what we call stimulation. And whether you were dealing with 5-year-olds in school or 80-year-olds in a nursing home, a life without stimulation is just as bad as a life with massive amounts of stress. So the question becomes, what is it that makes it stressful sometimes and stimulating in others? What constitutes good stress? And the general patterns are, it's not too severe. You know, you're on a roller coaster ride, and the danger is you're going to feel a little bit nauseous afterward, not that you're going to be decapitated during the ride. It doesn't go on for too long. the roller coaster ride is 3 minutes long, not 3 weeks long. And overall, it's occurring in a setting that is benevolent. You will see the people running the roller coaster are not there to ethnically cleanse you. They're there for you to like have a good time and for them to make money from it. And when we are in a safe setting and the challenge is only moderately severe and doesn't go on for too long, that's when we feel stimulated. And what do? We ask to lose control. We ask to be surprised. We ask for the movie plot to say, take a sudden turn and surprise us, or for the roller coaster to take a sudden dip when we didn't know what was coming. Because when it's in the context of us feeling safe, being surprised, lacking control, lacking information, is what we call play. And play is fantastic. Play is when you're feeling safe enough that you are willing to let circumstances surprise you. And that's what two dogs are doing when they play. The higher ranking one crouches down first, saying, for the next 3 minutes, I'm not going to be the higher ranking one. We're going to be so comfortable and so equal with each other that you could put your teeth on my throat, you could put your teeth on my crotch, and it's going to be just fine. And that's what play is, and that's pretty essential. Too little of it is boredom. Too much of it is of stimulation is massive stress. So that seems great. That seems totally straightforward and simple, except for the fact that the perfect ideal point, the right amount of stress, not too much, not too little, is going to be so different in you than it is from the person next to you, that's the major challenge. For one person, like a stimulatory challenge is going for like a brisk walk in the morning in the park. And for somebody else, it's signing up to be a mercenary in Yemen. And those are the circumstances where each of them feel like, yeah, this is really living. It's the individual variation in it that's extraordinary.
Eu queria aproveitar essa pergunta da Fernanda sobre estresse e eu queria que você comentasse o quanto que a pobreza, e mais do que a pobreza, a desigualdade pode afetar o nosso comportamento, desde quando a gente está na barriga da nossa mãe, até quando a gente já é um adulto formado.
Well, unfortunately, your country is just as familiar with mine in the ability to have vast inequality and to pretend large parts of the population don't really exist. In the United States, although I'm willing to be nationalistic and say we've got the worst inequality in the world when it comes to one measure, which is the impact of your socioeconomic status on your health. In every westernized country, the poorer you are, the worse your health, the shorter the life expectancy. And it is not because of the easy explanation, in the United States with our like medieval lack of universal health care, if you were poor, you cannot afford to go to the doctor, so you don't get good health. No, you see the exact same, what is called the socioeconomic gradient of health in countries with the universal medicine and socialized medicine and all of that. It's not as bad as in a place like the United States. So you say, okay, it isn't healthcare access. That's not it alone. And then you say, well, maybe it's because of quality of doctoring. No, you see the exact same curve for diseases that can be cured as for diseases that are uncurable. And then you say, well, maybe it's the fact that if you're poor, you're more likely to have a toxic waste dump next door to you than to have a nice fitness center to go and relax and work out. Is it risk factors? Is it protective factors? And you control for all of those, and it's only about a third of the variance that explained by that. What's it mostly about? It's the stress of poverty. And what's the best evidence for that? you sit somebody down and you can determine their objective socioeconomic status by all the rules of economics. And instead you ask them, so when you compare yourself to other people, how do you think you're doing? What is your subjective sense of your socioeconomic status? And the extraordinary thing is research showing your subjective socioeconomic status is at least as good of a predictor of your health as is your objective status. What does that tell you? It is not being poor, it is feeling poor that is the route to poor health. And what is the surest way of doing that? Exactly the point. Is it Arthur? I'm not sure the best Portuguese pronunciation, but the point you brought up before, what is the surest way to make somebody feel poor? Surround them with all the things they do not have, inequality. And what you see is the connection between poverty and poor health. Statistically, the mediating factor is the degree of inequality. It's not being poor, it's feeling poor. And the surest way to be feeling poor is to be reminded every minute of the day what it is they have and you don't. I guess the final piece of that, and this is all like wonderful research by extremely careful public health people that have shown this. The final piece of it is, so why is it that inequality makes people less healthy? And the answer is because inequality makes life more miserable. The sociology jargon here is social capital, the level of trust in your community, the level of a sense of efficacy, the level of a sense of control and organized power that you and people like you have. And what studies show is when inequality goes up, social capital goes down. People feel hopeless and powerless. People feel like they have no control. People feel like they have less trust in people because there's far more people who are willing to stab you in the back because of inequality, and more people you would consider stabbing in the back. Because when inequality increases, you don't have peers anymore because it's a steep gradient. You have fewer and fewer people who are where you are. You lose your community. And what is then shown is the way in which poverty produces poor health is mediated by the degree of inequality. And the link between inequality and poor health is mediated by how much of a decline of social capital there is in a community when there's lots of inequality. And what's that about? That's all about psychological stress. A world without much social capital is one that teaches you you have no control, you have no predictability, you have no social support. There are way too many people out there who are willing to do horrible things to you, and you have way too many societal temptations to do awful things to them. And there's no indication that it's getting better. Those are like the textbook prescriptions for feeling extremely stressed. And what's most informative is that the diseases that show the greatest sensitivity to socioeconomic status are the ones that are the most sensitively stress-related diseases.
Tem um outro, mudando um pouco de tema, mas voltando no final para esse mesmo, o seu livro também desfaz o mito da testosterona como um agente direto da violência, né? E mostra que é claro que ela é capaz de reforçar comportamentos violentos em pessoas que já têm tendências de agressividade. Mas o que me surpreendeu mais, lendo, foram os achados sobre ocitocina, que é, entre aspas, esse hormônio pacificador e que a gente espirra no nariz para amamentar os bebês, e que ele tem uma característica muito intrigante, que em certas circunstâncias ele reforça essa separação entre nós e eles, né? Ele reforça, de alguma forma, um comportamento preconceituoso, né? Que divide os grupos. Queria que você falasse um pouco sobre a influência dos hormônios na
Yeah.
violência.
Well, the example you bring up is, I love these findings, this hormone oxytocin. And oxytocin is like the most wonderful, heartwarming hormone on earth. If it mediates mothers bonding with their infants. If you're one of the rare species that pair bonds for life, it strengthens the pair bond. You give oxytocin to people, they become more generous, they become more trusting, they're better at reading emotions, all sorts of great stuff like that. Wow, why don't we put oxytocin in the water supply? It's the greatest thing ever. And what you then wind up seeing is exactly as you say, there's an interesting flip side to it. Oxytocin makes humans kinder and more sharing and more benevolent to people who seem like you are, to people who are one of us, to one of our in-group members. What does oxytocin do to out-group members? You become more rotten to them. And the perfect study, I love this study. This was one conducted in the Netherlands a few years ago, where they gave people basically this philosophy problem. Is it okay to kill one person to save five? And it's a standard sort of one in sort of moral philosophy and psychology. So they were giving it, of course, these were university students in the Netherlands. And what they did was something atypical in the study. They gave a name. Are you willing to kill this person to save these five other people? Are you willing to kill this person either in 1/3 of the cases with a classic good old boy Dutch name like Dirk or Peter or something like that, and the rest of the time either a German name or a Muslim name? Study showing in the Netherlands, Germans and Muslims consistently have the most negative connotations for people there. Oh, right, World War II, the Dutch didn't do very well with the Germans at that time. And so now you're being asked, well, are you going to sacrifice? Would you be willing to kill Dirk in order to save five people? How about Ahmed? How about Otto or Wolfgang or any of those? And what the study showed is when you give people oxytocin, they are much less willing to kill poor Dirk or Peter, and they can barely contain themselves from wanting to push, Mahmoud or Wolfgang under the bus there. What does oxytocin do? It doesn't make us nicer. It makes us nicer to people we're already nice to. And other studies showing it makes us more preemptively aggressive, more likely to cheat in a game, etc. To them, all it's doing is taking this divide and pushing it further. And that's a classic picture of what hormones do. They're not creating behaviors or beliefs or attitudes. They're just exaggerating the tendencies that social learning have already put there. And that's the same theme with testosterone. Testosterone does not make mammals more aggressive, males or females. It makes you more aggressive to the individuals you've already been aggressive to. All it does is just increase the volume of the social learning that is already there. So if you're blaming aggression on testosterone, that's wrong. Blame it on the social learning and the social values that built that brain that responds to testosterone that way.
Também mudando um pouco de assunto, eu queria falar sobre livre-arbítrio. Eu peguei uma frase aqui no novo livro do Brian Greene, o físico, que, aliás, vai ser lançado nos próximos meses também aqui no Brasil, pela Companhia das Letras, que chama Até o Fim dos Tempos. O Brian, ele fala assim, não acredito em livre-arbítrio. Não acredito que somos os atores principais das nossas ações. Acredito que nossas ações vêm das nossas partículas, governadas pelas leis da física. E nosso cérebro são apenas ótimos em criar uma narrativa para se encaixar uma história coerente, como se fosse um ghostwriter dessa história. Eu queria que você falasse sobre a sua visão do livre-arbítrio e como que isso influencia o nosso comportamento, a nossa cultura e as nossas crenças.
Well, nothing like a small question to take on. It's very nice to hear that quote because he and I happen to agree 100%. I do not believe there is free will whatsoever. I think that it has gotten to the point that to use words like blame or praise or reward or punishment are on the edge of being immoral because they are attributing something where it is not. We are not the agents of our behavior in the slightest. And what I always say, just to be provocative, because I'm a biologist rather than the physicist that he is I say free will is what we call the biology that we have not yet discovered, because all the last few centuries of science have been about is saying, oh, I had no idea the brain had something to do with that. Oh, I had no idea genes were relevant to this. The space for free will is getting smaller and smaller. And my personal view is there's no free will whatsoever. So that's fine. I've actually thought that way since I was about 14. And I managed to even convince some of my students to think that way. And then they usually have crises about that. And that's great. And I'm totally intellectually at peace with that. But at the same time, I have absolutely no idea how we're supposed to live believing that there's no free will. I mean, no matter what I think and no matter how much science, and if somebody says to me, wow, good job, you did it that, for at least 2.5 seconds, I feel like I deserved that. And if I hear about some appalling act that somebody has done, for at least 2.5 seconds, I want them to rot in hell, even though I don't believe there is a hell, before I say, wait a second, there's no free will. They're just the outcome of their circumstances, all of that. Like, if everybody actually started believing there was no free will, I can't even begin to imagine how we're all supposed to function. But what is clear is, if we're not doing that, we're creating a world of people feeling entitled for things they haven't earned, and people being blamed for things they are not responsible for. And the amount of pain that that causes is enormous.
Tem até uma outra pergunta que se relaciona com essa, que talvez eu vou puxar para frente. Arthur, me perdoe, tá? Mas é porque só para a gente ficar no
Faz
mesmo
todo
tema.
sentido.
Então, nesse sentido, as nossas decisões morais, especialmente no que diz respeito à intensidade dessas decisões, lendo seu livro, fica muito claro que elas são fortemente influenciadas por coisas muitas vezes superficiais ou contextuais ou totalmente subjetivas, como um cheiro ruim no momento de tomar uma decisão, né? Essa consciência, me parece, torna qualquer decisão bastante questionável e posicionamento, né? A pergunta é: você vislumbra no futuro a neurobiologia influenciando de maneira mais hegemônica áreas como o direito penal, por exemplo, ou mesmo o sistema educacional, ainda que de maneira terrivelmente distópica?
Se eu pudesse também completar, perguntar a sua opinião sobre o sistema prisional, como que a gente escolhe hoje, como sociedade, punir as pessoas, também baseado nessas, enfim, no livre-arbítrio e como a gente enxerga os nossos comportamentos.
Well, this is where I wade into what is always very controversial areas. People from our sort of world, we read books, we're horrified by the sorts of presidents who take over our countries, that sort of thing. probably all of us agree the criminal justice system needs all sorts of reform. It favors the wealthy too much, all that sort of stuff. That's actually not what I believe. I believe that the criminal justice system makes no sense whatsoever, that it is completely irrational. It is because we are machines. Punishing somebody for their actions is as ridiculous as punishing a car if its brakes don't work anymore. Now, of course, the issue then becomes, oh my God, are you saying that cars without brakes and murderers should be out on the streets freely? No, of course not. If a car's brakes don't work, you either fix it, and neurobiology is really bad at fixing broken brakes and brains at this point, because it's a very primitive science. And if you can't fix it, you put the car in a garage so it can't hurt anybody. And that's fine, but you don't sit there and preach to the car about why it deserves not to be able to go for a ride through a park on a nice afternoon kind of thing. And sort of if the response to that is, wow, it's so dehumanizing, turning us into machines, that's a lot better than moralizing us into being sinners with bad souls, because that's not what it is. So, the whole notion of criminal justice, I have a friend who's a professor in the law school at Stanford, and a couple of times he's let me lecture in one of his classes for the new law students, their first week of law school. And the title for my talk always is "Why You Should Quit Law School Immediately." And like I tell them, congratulations, you're starting in this profession that makes no sense whatsoever, and you're about to devote your life to a system that 500 years from now, we're going to view as making as little sense as the Inquisition did back in Torquemada in Spain, sort of thing. So get out while you can. And, big surprise, everybody 3 years later gets their law degrees, but it makes no sense at all. So you sit there and you say, oh my God, well, yeah, I guess that kind of makes sense. And Fernanda, the example you bring up, the smells, why did you make the moral decision you just did? Some of the time it has something to do with bad smells in the room that you're not even conscious of. Some of the time it has to do with the level of stress hormones you were exposed to when you were a fetus. Some of the time, it has something to do with the infectious disease load that your ancestral population had 500 years ago. Because all throughout Europe, the higher the infectious disease load in 1500, the bigger of a predictor it is of xenophobia now. Oh my God, a smell 1 second ago. What happened when you were a fetus, your genes, your upbringing, your childhood, your climate, whether your ancestors were living in rainforests or deserts, all of those. And like you look at all those pieces together and you say, okay, if you're still holding out for free will, here's how ecology generates cultures, which influences the way brains are put together in certain environments early in life, which will influence how plastic your brain is in this or that circumstance, which then just told your muscles to push this button instead of that button. Show me a neuron in that sequence. Show me the neuron that just told that muscle to do that, and show me how nothing about that neuron's function was affected by any of those other factors. And hooray, you've just proven there's free will. And you can't do that because every single molecule in that neuron bears the imprint of everything that happened up to that moment from beforehand. And when it's in that context, it really doesn't make any sense, all the realms in which we assume there's free will. And what's clear to me is that, yeah, it may be really hard to convince people to think about free will very differently when it comes to violence and crime and all of that. And I regularly try to teach juries about the brain in murder trials. And I have like such a low success rate at getting them to think differently. I'm an amazingly consistent failure at that. That's going to be really hard. 1,000-fold harder is the first time you say to somebody, wow, that's so great that you love books. That's really such a great thing about you. That's really terrific. And they say, yeah, what can I say? I'm an intellectual. I value facts over ideology, whatever it is. Yeah. And it's got nothing to do. And like, it's the same thing in that domain. And I'm convinced that's going to be even harder because the sort of people who think about this stuff spend a lot of time being congratulated for their intelligence or their self-discipline or their ability to focus or their ability to say no to temptations because there's a job to be done. All of that's just as biological. And no matter what I do, if somebody says good job to me, I'm going to have to stop and go through a very conscious process afterward of saying, you know, you don't really deserve to feel good right now. Stop being ridiculous like that. And that one, I think, is even harder than the damn, hang that guy tomorrow morning. Wait, no, not so fast. Ironically, I think it's going to be much harder for us in our good attributes because we spend an awful lot of time figuring out why it is we should feel entitled to our very privileged positions in our societies.
Acho que isso me leva a uma pergunta que, na verdade, foi feita pelo neurocientista brasileiro Siddhartha Ribeiro, que mandou uma pergunta. Eu vou fazer depois uma outra pergunta que tem a ver com ele também, com o trabalho dele, mas ele perguntou o seguinte: a inércia evolutiva dos comportamentos de opressão patriarcal vão permitir o ajustamento da conduta da masculinidade?
Well, I think the best way to fall back onto science with it, by the way, did I hear correctly that the individual's first name is Siddhartha?
Eu posso... Siddhartha Ribeiro é um neurocientista brasileiro e...
Siddhartha, as in Buddha, you had some very interesting parents. I congratulate you on having picked the right family to be born into. That had to have all sorts of good effects on you. Okay, so masculinity. I think the thing, you know, I'm a primatologist, and like it's hard not to think about large aspects of human behavior in the context of evolution. And one of the things about sort of toxic masculinity and looking at us as a species, you look at primates, you look at the 150 or so species of primates, and they generally fall into two categories. Either they are a monogamous pair bonding species, and you see their male parental behavior and low levels of aggression, and females and males do the same things for babies, and they're about the same size and all that sort of thing. And as it turns out, virtually all of the South American primates are monogamous pair bonders, marmosets, tamarins, and such. Or you have what are called the tournament species, like baboons, where high levels of male-male aggression, and one male does 95% of the mating, and females are regularly injured by males, and they're half the size of males. And discover a new primate and look at it for 2 seconds, and you can tell by the shape of the skull, you can tell by the length of the male's canines, you can tell by looking at their genomes, is this a pair bonding species or is this a tournament species? Discover a completely new one, and you know it within 3 seconds just by watching. So humans, where do we fit? And what is absolutely clear is by every measure, okay, in monogamous species show low levels of sexual dimorphism, differences in body size according to your sex. Tournament species show high levels. That's where you have males with big manes and ridiculous peacock things. That's where you see females are half the size of males. That's where you see just every anatomical thing you can measure, brain differences. Humans, we're a sexually dimorphic species. We're about halfway between classic primate monogamous ones and classic primate tournament species. By every measure, by like the average difference between males and females in the size of your lungs, the average distance in between your eyes, the average life expectancy, the average weight of a male's testicles, if you're a human male, is about, when you look at it as a percentage of body weight, it's about halfway between what you would see in a chimp or a baboon or a marmoset or a tamarin. By every measure and every behavioral measure and every genetic measure, we're somewhere about halfway in between. And like anyone who is a lawyer for people getting divorced, or anyone who is a poet, knows exactly what the consequences are of that, which is that we are very, very confused as a species, because we're somewhere in the middle there. And not just are we on the average in the middle, we have tremendous individual variation. There are some people out there who could like pass as a marmoset very easily and get along with them, and other people who would be just fine in a baboon troop, and everything in between. And interestingly, for example, oxytocin levels in us and our genetics of that predict something about individual differences in human behavior. So we've got massive differences there. So is there anything inevitable about human social patterns, especially with respect to aggression, especially with respect to sex differences, especially with respect to dominance relations between the sexes? Absolutely not, because we're floating somewhere in between. And what that tells you, among other things, is the genetics of being human are such that you are the freest from your genes of any primate species out there. And that explains all that malleability. And that's the only way we could be a species in rainforest and tundra and desert and monogamous religions and polygamist and socialist and capitalist and urban and hunter-gatherer. And the only way we could be that way is to just have this enormous flexible freedom from our genetic determinism. And in that regard, what I think that tells you is anyone who says some of the worst aspects of human behavior, and we all know how much of that is often tied around men being men, that that's inevitable, that that's universal, that's nonsense. That's certainly not the case.
Eu queria, no seu livro, você fala sobre a grande fome que houve na Holanda durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial e como que isso influenciou doenças nas pessoas 30, 40, 50 anos depois. E quando a gente estava um pouco antes dessa entrevista ser iniciada, a gente estava falando sobre o que você disse como essa grande experiência de estresse que está sendo a pandemia. Eu queria saber, na sua opinião, o que você acha que vão ser as consequências agora que, basicamente, o mundo inteiro sofreu de forma, vamos dizer, mais linear o mesmo tipo de estresse por tanto tempo. O que isso pode causar para a nossa espécie daqui a 20 ou 30 anos?
I think the consequences are going to be enormous. Psychologically, disease patterns, all of that, social structures, some of that will be difficult to separate away from us simultaneously destroying our planet and the effects of that. But the pandemic is going to have enormous effects. The specific version you bring up, which is what does experience as a fetus have to do with adult disease patterns and health, but adult behavior, adult psychiatric vulnerability, all of that, that's well established by now. And we even know how that works in the brain, because when you're a fetus, that's when a lot of the first blueprints for your brain are being unfolded. So certainly in the United States, 300,000 individuals have just spent the pandemic being fetuses and a mother with COVID. And 60 years from now, that is going to be having an effect on them. But overall, this is going to be having an effect on every one of us. And the example that always comes to mind for me is I grew up, my age, my parents' age, whatever, where if I was 20 and they were doing something that was driving me crazy, and I was so frustrated with them, very frequently, the response I would have to get to is, wait a second, remember when they were your age, they were going through the Great Depression, the one that started in 1929 in the US. You got to remember they went through that. And I am absolutely sure my kids who are roughly college age, when their kids 30 years from now are in college and they're complaining about their parents being impossible and so frustrated, and they're going to say, wait, I got to remember when they were my age, that's when the COVID thing was happening. It's going to leave that sort of imprint. This is, once in many generations of an impact that there will be. I think that's absolutely going to be the case. And one of the things we can predict with the greatest confidence is that the consequences are going to be totally unpredictable, and in areas we would never guess that this is how things are going to go very, very wrong as a result. The grandchildren of people who were fetuses during that Dutch hunger winter have different disease patterns because they inherited different patterns of gene regulation. The grandchildren of people who survived the Holocaust have different brain function. It's going to be the same. You are bearing the imprint of not only where you came from, but where your people came from and where your species came from. And what this pandemic is doing cannot possibly have anything but a lot of bad consequences down the line.
Seguindo um pouco na pandemia, na sua observação durante esse período agora, imagino que você tenha lidado também com populações de outros primatas que foram acometidos por doenças e se você enxergou semelhanças ou algo notável, e se isso de alguma forma ressoa um pouco nesse trabalho, nesse livro que foi publicado antes. Na verdade, esse livro está saindo agora no Brasil, mas ele foi publicado originalmente em 2017, né? O Behave. Então, se teria algo a acrescentar nesse sentido.
Well, being a good professor, of course, my answer is yes and no. The effects of crises like this on primate behavior in general, it depends. It depends on the context. You become more socially connected to, more supportive of those you already are close to. For example, among female baboons, if your infant dies, for 2 months afterward, not only are your stress hormones elevated, but those of your sisters and your mother and your other kids are elevated during that time, and you all sit closer to each other on the average, and you groom more. And the more you groom, the less of a stress response there is. Oh, that's wonderful, we're reaching out. At the same time, if you're a baboon and you're being stressed because somebody is challenging you in your position, about 55% of the time, the most likely thing you are to do afterward is to attack somebody who is smaller and weaker than you. Aha, the majority of baboon aggression is somebody taking out their frustration on somebody smaller than them. So, whoa, we have crisis bringing us together and crisis driving us apart if we're baboons, and the same exact thing as humans. And In the US, we've seen astonishing moments of self-sacrifice and care during this, and astonishing moments of indifference and cruelty and scapegoating. And it certainly did not help having a government that begged us to scapegoat people for everything going wrong during that time, rather than seeing who really was at fault. For much of it, crises push us to our extremes. It brings out the best in us of those who already lean that way, the worst in others. Every now and then there's a great exception, and that's a big surprise. But for the most part, it just makes us more extreme at who we already are. And what that's mostly been during this pandemic is bad news.
Posso fazer mais uma?
Vai lá.
Queria voltar um pouco para a masculinidade, mas no seu campo de pesquisa, a atividade de observação ela é muito forte, né? E diferentes observadores, eu imagino, ela é muito interpretativa, por um lado, e diferentes observadores interpretam de formas diferentes, eventualmente, os mesmos fenômenos. Então, eu queria saber se a maior diversidade de cientistas, não só no gênero, mas raça, diferentes origens, culturas, o quanto isso tem ampliado o olhar da ciência, a produção científica. Como você enxerga isso?
It should increase quality by focusing a light in directions where it normally isn't. Perfect example. Clinical dogma used to be that the standard dose of an antidepressant that you would give somebody when they are depressed, you've got to be a little bit careful because women are overly sensitive to that dose. You are more likely to get side effects. So be careful about that. Keep that in mind. And at some point, somebody figured out that the better way of explaining it is that men are overly sensitive to this drug. Or rather that men are undersensitive to this drug, and thus you have to remember to push up their levels more. When did that happen? When suddenly there were a whole lot of biological psychiatrists around who were female. Oh, what do you know? Being able to look at the same facts from a completely different perspective. That's certainly the case in primatology. In the 1980s, there was this radical, revolutionary view in primatology that sometimes females have some control over who they mate with. Oh my God, like this was at the barricades, Bolshevik primatology, all of that. This was incredible, this phenomenon of female choice. And what was happening around then, what was becoming the case was the best primatologists in the world were all female. And they were able to look at it from that perspective. And yeah, absolutely, that's the case. You get more diversity in your scientists, and what even counts as a disease is going to change. What even counts as a cure, what even, big cultural differences, and what is mentally healthy in one culture is mentally ill in another. I mean, I remember sort of during my postdoctoral period, you spend 2 years being an apprentice to somebody, and it's 2 years. And if you're lucky, you then get a faculty position. And all you do is work your ass off for those 2 years. And during that time, I was living in this city in here, San Diego, doing that. And during the course of those 2 years, I never spoke a word to my neighbors. And when I would talk to my friends in Kenya, when I would be out doing field work, when I would talk to a psychiatrist there, that was a sign of mental illness in Kenya. If you went 2 years without talking to your neighbor, let alone helping them when their goat was giving birth or something, that was, huge cultural differences. What was I doing? I was getting complimented instead on how motivated I was and how much I could focus on my work. And, what counts is healthy and sick is just as culturally variable and diverse as what counts as good or bad behavior. So absolutely, as science becomes more diverse, that can only be for the better.
Eu também aproveitar que você falou sobre a sua experiência no Quênia, e você fala também nos seus livros sobre dois tipos de pessoas, né? As pessoas do tipo Spock, que são pessoas racionais, e pessoas irracionais. E você também fala sobre os feitos extraordinários que os seres humanos fazem, principalmente na época que eles são mais jovens. E você escreve um capítulo do seu livro que é maravilhoso, que se chama-se Dude, cara, onde está o meu córtex pré-frontal? E você tomou uma decisão importante quando você tinha 21 anos, que você saiu de Nova York, se eu não me engano, e você foi direto para o Quênia. Eu queria que você contasse um pouco dessa... Por que você tomou essa decisão? Se era porque o teu córtex pré-frontal não estava funcionando direito. E, enfim, quais foram as coisas extraordinárias que você viu lá pelo fato de você ter tomado essa decisão?
Well, just to give that neurobiological context, the prefrontal cortex, if you had to summarize what it does, it's the part of the brain that gives you self-discipline and long-term planning and controlling your impulses and emotional regulation. We've got more of it than any other species. It's the most recently evolved part of our brains. And the amazing thing is it's also the last part of our brain to fully mature. Most of your brain is in its adult form by the time you're 10 years old. Prefrontal cortex is still being put together until you're about 25. So what does that explain? And that explains teenagers, that explains young adults, that explains all those things. So that's the biological backdrop for that. My heading off to do field work at that point in Africa, just to complicate it in terms of prefrontal cortical maturation stuff, I actually decided I was going to be a field primatologist when I was 8 years old. I just decided that it was somehow I migrated from could a Tyrannosaurus Rex beat up a Brontosaurus kid obsession into archaeology, into primatology. And by the time I was like 10 years old, I was writing fan letters to primatologists. I occasionally run across these people. They're all elderly now, and they sort of remember these really like over the top crazed letters from some kid back when. I went to study at college with this guy because he was the king of baboon primatology, and I had been like worshiping at his feet since I was about 12 or so. I was very intent on that. I think in retrospect, you see people who do field work, and over the years, and I spent 33 summers out in my field work in Kenya, when you see people doing that, the majority of them are people who grew up in a place like that. Their parents were field workers, or their parents were missionaries, or their parents were aid people in some developing country or some such thing. So that's one profile. And then there are the people who come from some god-awful neighborhood in some urban hellhole. And when they were about 8 years old, they stumbled into the Natural History Museum and they saw the dioramas of the elephants or of the giraffe or of the whales or the dolphins or the primates and saying, God damn it, I am getting out of this neighborhood and I am going to live in that diorama someday. And that was my version of it in a tough neighborhood in New York, and falling in love with the dioramas at the American Museum of Natural History and saying, that's where I'm going. That's where I'm going to be one day. That's how I'm going to get out of all of this. So I happened to bring a very, very early obsession with that. And it was only later that I decided I also wanted to be a neurobiologist and sort of combined the two. So in terms of how much I was an adolescent in those decisions, yeah, it somehow came even earlier than that. But sort of once I got to Kenya, I certainly was capable of some very stupid disinhibited behaviors, showing that I did not yet have a fully mature frontal cortex. When I was 21, I hitchhiked into a war zone because I wanted to see what was going on there. And that was not a good idea, but it sure seemed like the irresistible one at the time. So yeah, in lots of ways, I was a subadult primate at the time in my behavior, and fortunately I survived all that.
Acho que a gente está se encaminhando aqui para o final. Eu queria fazer já um agradecimento para a Ana Viana, que está fazendo essa tradução para a gente. Queria agradecer muito ela.
Thank you.
Eu tenho uma última pergunta, mas aí acho que o Arthur que tem uma pergunta mais importante que a minha, então eu vou abrir mão da minha para dar tempo.
Não, Fê, eu acho que dá tempo, sim. Faz a tua pergunta e depois eu faço a minha, sim.
Eu queria retomar Então tá, então vou voltar aqui. Aquele neurocientista que fez a pergunta, que é esse Siddhartha Ribeiro, escreveu esse livro, é um livro sobre a importância evolutiva e a neurofisiologia do sonho. Ele defende que uma das grandes perdas contemporâneas da era do smartphone foi a gente parar de sonhar esse sonho, que é um sonho importante para a saúde mental. Né? A gente não cultiva o sonho e não sonha mais também. E ele sugere que a gente retome esse hábito. Você também escreveu sobre sonho, mas a minha pergunta existem outros hábitos individuais que não sejam óbvios e que nos trouxeram até aqui e que têm sido negligenciados e que a gente poderia retomar?
Sure. The importance of primate contact, physical contact, any baboon, any chimp, any marmoset could tell you that without that, you're really in trouble. We underemphasize that. And of course, the easiest realm where that has come through is social media, where your entire world can be revolving around individuals you're disconnected from in that way. I think in terms of making sense of some of the things we should keep in mind most in sort of understanding our worst behaviors is the fact that we do something that not only no other primate ever does, but that humans never did for 99% of their history, which is we spend a large part of our time around strangers, individuals we don't know, individuals we don't have either a realistic or psychologically obtained sense of relatedness to, similarity, all of that. So much of the mind that we bring is one of hunter-gatherers, because that was 99% of human history, in small bands of people who knew each other. And we are being asked to navigate worlds surrounded by strangers where we can be anonymous. And that leaves us being more rotten in our behavior. And it also leaves us lonelier. And I think an understanding of primates did not evolve to be solitary, but primates also did not evolve to be surrounded by strangers all day long. And that's the worlds we've constructed.
Bom, acho que vou fazer a minha última pergunta. Eu queria, infelizmente, o tempo está acabando. Eu queria agradecer de novo, enfim, a Fernanda, minha amiga e sócia querida, pela oportunidade de estar aqui junto, toda a equipe da Megafauna, a Companhia das Letras, é claro, por ter nos ajudado. E, Robert, eu queria também te agradecer profundamente por você ter aceitado esse nosso convite, você ter devotado esse tempo para a gente. lendo a sua obra, na minha cabeça, eu sempre coloquei você como um tradutor das ciências para gente, para leigos. E tem um outro matemático e filósofo que eu admiro muito, que é o Bertrand Russell, que para mim ele é um tradutor também da ciência como você. E tem uma entrevista dele, uma das entrevistas dele na BBC de Londres, se eu não me engano, que fazem uma pergunta para ele que eu queria replicar essa mesma pergunta para você. A pergunta é assim: suponha que esta entrevista seja vista por nossos descendentes, como os pergaminhos do Mar Morto, daqui a 1000 anos. O que o senhor acha importante falar para essa geração sobre a sua vida e as lições que você aprendeu? Muito obrigado.
Well, great question, and I'll have to see what good old Bertrand answered to that, one of my heroes. The only thing I could answer is one recognizing not just our descendants generations from now, but probably most of us in our lifetimes will look back at us at earlier times and say, my God, the damage we caused because of the things we didn't understand at the time. When psychiatry figured out that mothers didn't cause schizophrenia because of their Freudian hostility, and instead it was brain chemistry, any number of them in their old age say, my God, the damage I did to patients. What we look back on. So I think if they're looking back on us, almost certainly they will be horrified at our ignorance, horrified by the arrogance and confidence with which we acted on that ignorance. And I think all I would say is some of us tried. We did the best we could do with what we had. And we tried to remember that this was like all we had at the moment. And we weren't in very good shape, but this was all we could do.
Obrigada. Obrigada e boa noite para todo mundo. Obrigada pela presença desse público virtual. A gente espera muito receber você presencialmente no Brasil em algum momento. Será muito bem-vindo.
Well, that would be great. And thank you for this wonderful hosting. And I wish all of you very good luck with both the pandemic and your president. And hopefully we will all get through this period with our humanity intact. So thank you.